We next hear from financial economist and historian Michael Hudson. Michael Hudson is a Wall Street financial analyst and distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri-Kansas City. Today's show, Modern Money Theory and Private Banks. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter.
One of the last questions before lunch this morning was, how is it that Italians are so poor and work so hard if Berlusconi can have so many girlfriends? So just imagine how your world was back in 1945. Suppose you were alive in 1945 and somebody had told you about all of the new technology that would be invented between then and now. What if you were told about all the computers, the internet, the communications and television, the jet air travel, the super trains, the increased glass mileage, the plastics, the medical breakthroughs? You would have imagined that we all would be living in a life of leisure society by this time. And in fact, all of this was celebrated as a post-industrial economy. And indeed, productivity has grown so much that under all of the textbook models, the idea was that rising productivity would be passed on to labor in the form of lower prices, so wages would go further, or higher wages. The whole idea was who was to get the fruits of all of this productivity. And in all the textbooks, there was what was called Say's law. Workers had to be able to buy the results of what they produced. And this was a circular flow, the circular flow between producers and consumers. And this idea goes all the way back to the French physiocrats, just before the French Revolution, who created economics and account keeping. The founder of physiocracy, François Quesnay, was a medical doctor and a surgeon, and he based the idea of national income accounting on the circular flow within the body between producers and consumers. So the idea was that all of this increased production had to be increased consumption. So the idea was, as a variant of functional finance, that production creates its own market for consumption by paying workers who then buy the products they produce. So the question is, why hasn't this occurred? With all of this productivity since the end of World War II, and especially since 1980, why aren't you all rich and enjoying a leisure economy? And after World War II, mainly the men worked and the women were at home. Since 1945, women have been forced into the labor force for what are called two-job families, and now they're three-job families. If you project labor participation rates, by the year 2020, every woman will have to work 18 hours a day, and her children will have to begin working at the age 3 to sustain their standard of living. If you are going to have children, you'd better send them to work at the age of 3, or you will go broke. Well, obviously, what has happened is that what was applauded as the post-industrial economy has become the financialized economy. The reason you are working so much harder than you were before is because you're paying off your debts. You're not buying the goods and services that you produce. You're paying the banker, because you can only maintain your consumption standards and keep on spending what you produce if you borrow to do it. That is the Euro plan for you. That is how the Euro plan is replacing industrial capitalism with finance capitalism. Wages and living standards have not risen. All of the gains have been siphoned off by finance. And it's not, when they call for austerity, it is not the fat that they're cutting. The fat is the financial sector. It's the bone. It's the industrial sector. So the post-industrial economy means deindustrialization. It means unemployment for you, and unemployment means lower wages. In all of the economics textbooks, in Economics 101, as you saw on the door, there are supply and demand curves. The idea is that the higher the employment rate, the more you have to pay labor to drive it into the labor force. So the government officials and the bankers read these textbooks and they say, okay, so the less employment, the more wages go down and the more we earn. And so we want unemployment in order to maximize the power of our wealth over labor. 150 years ago, this was called the Reserve Army of the Unemployed. You need unemployment to keep labor down. So, despite the fact that you have productivity rising since World War II, the real economy and your wages have become an S-curve, tapering off. What has grown in keeping with productivity is the magic of compound interest. This growth in compound interest has absorbed all of the increase in productivity, and it's accrued to the 1%, not to the 99%. So when you understand this, you have to understand how to answer the questions that were raised before lunch today. The key is, look at how today's economy is different from what occurred in 1945, and you'll see that we're at the end of a long cycle. Back in 1945, in every country, the private sector was relatively free of debt. There was very little for consumers to buy in the war, and companies had little reason to invest except for the government. So most families had very little debt, but they had a lot of savings. And today the economy is the reverse. The savings have been run down and the economy is in debt. It's important to know how this occurs, to know how to stop the process that has taken place for the last 70 years. The reason is not only financial, it's been fiscal. The taxes have been shifted off banks and their customers, mainly real estate and monopolies, onto labor. In the United States, for instance, in the 1930s, 70% of all state and local tax revenues came from real estate, from the property tax. Today, only 1/6 comes from that. States and cities have been convinced to lower the property tax burden and to take an income tax and a sales tax, and the worst, most anti-labor tax of all, your value-added tax. Your value-added tax is intruding onto the market and shrinking it and preventing you from buying the goods that you produce. And they're taking your value-added tax and they're giving it to the bankers who control your governments and control your politicians, and when even your politicians can't sell out, they then say we need a technocrat to impose even more taxes, to tax you, labor, more, to give more to the banks, to bail them out, because the plan they have for you doesn't work, and it leaves somebody bankrupt, and it's not going to be the banks, because they're who give us our jobs. So in the United States, for instance, one problem is that in 1982, Alan Greenspan, a free marketer, headed a Social Security Commission and said, Social Security should not be a public service. It should be a user fee. We have to make the private sector, the users, the laborers, pay for it. And they not only have to pay for it, they have to pay 5 times as much as they get to the banks. Because my clients, the bankers, we have overhead. The saver in America, the pensions were paid by bankers saving the money in advance, creating a huge budget surplus, giving the surplus to the government, so that the government would cut taxes on real estate, cut taxes on finance, cut taxes on the rich, cut them in half, cut capital gains taxes, and then say, now we're broke, we have to increase the Social Security tax further because the workers have not paid enough to Social Security to give it enough money to fight the war in Iraq, to fight the war in Iran, to fight the war in Afghanistan, and most of all, to fight the class war against labor.
You're listening to financial economist and historian Michael Hudson. Today's show, Modern Money Theory and Private Banks. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter.